Hello, welcome to Bookspin. Thanks for dropping by. So I saw that the finalists for the 2024 Hugo Awards were announced the other day, and I was curious to discover there's one particular story that was nominated in the Best Novella category, and this is Seeds of Mercury by Wang Jingkang. And I read this story last year. Wang Jingkang is quite a prominent author in China, from what I can tell, but he's a bit of an unknown in the West. Not a lot of his stuff has been translated. So I'm glad that this particular story is getting more attention. I read it last year in this anthology, Adventures in Space, and I thought it was a really standout read. I think it was the best story in this collection. There's also another story that's from the same anthology that's by Hershey that's also been nominated this year, which is also worth checking out. But Seeds of Mercury is a really fascinating story. It's about the construction of an artificially created life form. It can only survive in very extreme conditions, super high temperatures, and it's about a project where this life form gets sent to Mercury as part of an experiment to see whether it can survive there and what will happen to it, and ultimately what's going to happen to this new species over huge periods of time as evolution takes its course. So there are some sort of Children of Time like vibes going on in this story. It's a neat little story, well worth checking out. And this kind of got me thinking, what makes a great sci-fi novella? What are some of the characteristics, and what are some of the best examples of science fiction literature in this category? Because I think a good novella can sometimes be just the right thing to read. It's short, but it's not too short. It's a good palate cleanser between longer novels, but with more depth for exploring ideas and plot development than you can find or there's possible in a short story. So if you find yourself in a bit of a reading slump, I think reading a good novella can be a great way to try something new without committing yourself to something that's going to take up much of your time. Now, I'm not really an expert in this area. I've only read a few SF novellas. I've definitely read more novels and short stories than actual novellas. But there are a few really fantastic novellas out there that I've really enjoyed. So I'm going to recommend 5 of them. I'm going to mention a couple more that are on my radar. I haven't read yet, but I do want to read. So before we get stuck in, I should just clarify what I mean by novella, because it can be a bit of a nebulous term. So a novella is usually defined as having an upper limit of 40,000 words. So it's usually kind of between 20,000 and 40,000 words. In fact, the Hugos define a novella as a story between 17,500 to 40,000 words. I'm pretty sure that all of these stories fit into this category. This is not a ranking list or anything like that. This is just a few sci-fi novellas which I have particularly enjoyed. So let's take a look. So first up, Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which you can find in this collection, Stories of Your Life and Others. Now, this is actually one of the first science fiction novellas that I read several years ago when I was just sort of stepping my toes into science fiction. This is a really superb collection. It's got a consistent set of interesting and engaging stories with fascinating themes. And Story of Your Life is arguably the showcase, the highlight of this collection. It's a philosophical first contact story in which a mysterious group of aliens known as heptapods arrive on Earth. And we follow a linguist and her journey as she tries to understand them. But they're pretty inscrutable. And it's definitely not a straightforward narrative. This is a very high concept tale. It's quite bold and experimental in its storytelling. And there are some pretty mind-bending ideas, such as the concept of time considered not as an external reality, but as a subjective experience. That's a major theme. So it is very memorable. It's very thought-provoking. And this is in fact a story that the movie Arrival is based on. So consider giving it a read if you haven't already done so. It's a great piece of modern science fiction. Now, my next recommended novella is something a bit older. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. You can't get more classic than this. This is one of the definitive works of early science fiction. So I read it as part of this collection. In this story, we follow a Victorian inventor protagonist who builds a time machine and uses it to travel to the past. No, not the past, the future, the far future. And it's there that he finds himself in a strange new society populated by two races of post-humans. And these are in fact descendants of the upper class and the working class of his own day. And what has happened is that they have diverged so much over time that they've now become two distinct species. But far from evolving into advanced beings, humanity has actually degenerated and become weaker over time. So you've got these two different races, and the relationship between them is not very good. It's characterized by fear and exploitation and violence. So this story is clearly a social allegory, but it works well on multiple levels. So, I mean, you can just enjoy this story as a kind of quaint time travel adventure. It's short and it's easy to read. And it's actually quite a riveting tale. But at the same time, it's much more than that. It's a class fable on the social inequalities and injustices which were so prevalent in society that Wells was from. And it's still very much with us today, of course. Remember, Wells was an outspoken socialist. So The Time Machine is not my personal favourite of his, but there's no doubt that it's a timeless classic and it's very enjoyable to read. And next up, I want to talk about The Mist by Stephen King. So this is a sci-fi horror novella that is the opener to his 1985 collection called Skeleton Crew. It's a gripping and atmospheric story with definite Lovecraftian horror vibes. We have a father and a son who are the main protagonists. A small town setting. In fact, most of the story takes place within a supermarket. So it's quite a mundane setting, but it is actually very horrific. Very quickly, all hell breaks loose when the town is suddenly enveloped in this thick and opaque mist. It descends down onto the town, And this mist is not, it's not only very mysterious, but it's also very dangerous. And it hides all manner of horrors with bizarre and terrifying creatures who have entered our world from another dimension, lurking at every turn within the mist. So, in the story, we follow the narrator and his son as they take refuge in the supermarket while the world outside has transformed into an apocalyptic nightmare. It's classic Stephen King with great character building and great narrative tension. Definitely worth checking out. And now the next thing I'd like to recommend, this is something by one of my favourite authors, Alistair Reynolds, and it's called The Six Directions of Space. So I've got it here in a standalone hardback novella. This novella takes place in the far future. It takes something that I think this writer does very well, i.e. high stakes, hard SF space opera, and it condenses this into 85 pages of epic and immersive storytelling. And this takes place in an alternate version of the future in which the Mongol Empire of medieval times never fell. In fact, they have expanded and taken over the whole Earth, and now they have expanded out into space to create a vast galactic empire. And it's in this universe that we follow a government spy who has been sent out to investigate some strange goings on at the periphery of the empire, which indicate possible rifts in time and space. So this is something to look out for if you're a fan of things like parallel universes and alternate history, as well as space opera. It's very fascinating, and it's quite an ambitious premise for a book of its length. But it's Alistair Reynolds, so of course he pulls it off really well. It can be quite difficult and expensive to get hold of. I found my copy on eBay, but I do recommend seeking it out and reading it if you can find it. And finally, I'd like to recommend The Dead Lady of Clowntown by Cordwainer Smith, which you can find in his collection, The Rediscovery of Man, one of my favourite books. So all of the stories within this collection are set in a future history that he calls the instrumentality of mankind. So The Dead Lady of Clowntown is the longest story in this collection. And like the others, it is pretty surreal. But this story in particular has got quite an evocative, fable-like quality to it. It concerns the plight of the underpeople, who are a race of animals that have been uplifted into intelligent humanoid beings. But they're basically tools who have been enslaved and oppressed by humans for many generations, and they have no rights at all. So in this tale, we follow one of these underpeople, a dog girl whose name is Dejone, and she is the visionary leader of a revolutionary movement that seeks to liberate the underpeople and create a society based on love and equality. It's basically a reimagining of the Joan of Arc story with a surreal far future setting. And I think of all the Cordwainer Smith stories that I've read, this has the most poignant and moving quality to it. It's something that stays with you long after you've read it. So, those are 5 science fiction novellas that I thoroughly enjoyed and I would recommend. But I know there are a lot more out there. So feel free to share your thoughts in the comments if you've read any of these, or if you have any other novellas that you would recommend. I'd love to hear from you. Now, there are a couple more novellas on my TBR that I'm keen to read, but I haven't got around to yet. So I'll just briefly mention those. One is this book, Binti, by Nnedi Okorafor, which, from what I've heard, is quite a celebrated story. It's an African futurist story about a girl who is she sets off to attend an interstellar university out in space. That's about as much as I know. But I did read this author last year with her novel Lagoon, which I enjoyed, and I do want to give this book a try. And the other book, the other novella, is Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which I have heard is a very cleverly done science fantasy that manages to blend both genres of science fiction and fantasy in a very interesting way. But I don't own that one yet. So again, let me know if you've read either of these, and if you think I ought to bump them up the TBR at all. So, that's it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.